say that there's a myth about we have an idea about who will end up having an addictive personality?
Yeah. We have this idea that there's a certain personality type, and that person is almost destined to have problems with an addiction. And it's really quite a bit of a myth because it limits our scope in terms of this image is what someone with an addiction looks like, when in reality, all different types of people can struggle with an addiction, and and you wouldn't even know it for a lot of people. It's invisible, and you wouldn't even know it for a lot of people. It's invisible. Functioning people with addictions, they could be doing it in the workplace, for example. It could make them actually look more productive, particularly if they're using a stimulant like cocaine or smaller amounts of crystal meth. Uh, these things can really fly under the radar. And so we have this kind of idea of what it looks like to have an addiction. And really, the research doesn't really confirm that there's a particular personality set that actually stands out for all addictions.
Right.
And so if you do the psychology of personality and you kind of map on addictions, there's no kind of standard, this is the one personality. But there are certain types of traits that could be correlated with certain types of addictions. Um,
What kind of traits would you say are more likely to be present in someone who has who will likely develop an addiction?
so according to the research, it's some research shows that it could be novelty seeking, like or risk taking
Right.
traits, and those kind of go hand in hand with like stimulant use, for example. But it's not necessarily like a general rule you would go by for all
Right.
people. It's just kind of there's some evidence and some research that the novelty seeking and risk taking personalities can be something to look at as well. But there's no kind of overarching, big five personality trait correlation that it's the one set of things. You might be able to say high levels of neuroticism if you're looking at the big five personality traits. Neuroticism means high levels of negative emotion.
Right.
And so that could be something to look at as well, because addictions are used as a way to cope with
Mm-hmm.
negative emotion, to cope with pain, to cope
Yeah.
with past trauma, unmet needs. So that could be something as well. But there's no kind of broad set of all of the big five that you can say this is the one thing to look for.
Um, you say that there is such a thing as being addicted to your phone, and that increasingly you're actually treating people for this.
Okay, yeah, that's very true. And actually, I worked for a local organization that specializes in digital dependency. That's what they called it. It's a recognized thing, and it's not officially in the DSM-5, the
Right.
Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, but it's in the footnotes in terms of gaming disorder,
Right.
internet and gaming disorder. So this would kind of fall under that subset of things. It would be similar to that, but also very similar to something that is in the DSM officially, which is gambling disorder,
Right.
where the vast majority of my background comes in the addiction field. Because if you look at what a smartphone is and what social media platforms do, they're almost like having little slot machines in your pocket.
Right.
And what is so addictive about a slot machine? Well, it's the random intermittent reward schedule. So you're randomly becoming rewarded as much random as you can have. There's no perfect randomness, but there's algorithms that can produce some kind of randomness. And that's very addictive because you don't know when it's going to be rewarding you.
Mm.
And there's
Yeah.
psychological studies that show with rats that if you have a predictable reward schedule, like if they hit it every 10 times and then they get rewarded, they soon are not as interested because they can predict it.
Right.
But if you make that reward schedule random, so it's not every 10 times, it's sometimes every 2 times, sometimes every 20 times, and you never know when that reward's going to happen, that triggers our dopamine response in our brain, which is a kind of a learning mechanism that tries to find a pattern. And because you're not giving it a pattern, it's spiking to like, okay, this is when it happened. And it tries to encode that in memory, like, okay, remember that. But
Mhm.
so random that it doesn't allow you to actually find a pattern. So you're constantly striving for it, and that's that kind of constant sense of yearning comes from when gambling. You're just like, where's the reward going to happen? What's the pattern? You're always looking for it. People come up with stories about the patterns, and they come up with these ideas and ways to imagine they've predicted a pattern, even though it doesn't exist. Now, take that logic of gambling addiction, apply it to a smartphone where it's randomly rewarding you, not perfectly random. There's obviously patterns in terms of when people are messaging you or liking your stuff, but enough
Yeah.
that you never know when that like is going to come through, when you're going to be mentioned in a comment. When someone's mentioned in a comment and then the notification comes up, says you so and so mentioned you in a post or a comment, you're
Yes.
going to want to click that and you're going to say, what did they say about me? Or if
Right.
you get an email, you might wonder, oh, am I going to be rewarded with some opportunity? Is somebody going to want to
Yes.
interview me like this right now? Is somebody going to offer me money? Is it a client? What is the opportunity? So you're getting randomly, not perfect, but fairly random, intermittently rewarded through social media platforms, through email, and all of these digital stimuli where you never quite know when the next thing's going to land in your inbox or in your messenger or in your notifications. And it's like having a slot machine in your pocket. Now, this gets beyond the level of addiction into almost like an OCD area, obsessive and compulsive disorder. And I don't use that term lightly. People are like, "Oh, I have OCD," whatever. And they use it very lightly. But this is almost very similar to actually diagnosable OCD, which I don't diagnose or I don't treat OCD at all. But I know a thing or two about it and can speak about it as more from a researcher perspective. That
Please.
this is where because addiction is you're kind of chasing a stimuli or some kind of pleasure often, and you could see that in the previous example. There's a reward being presented. This is slightly different in that there's more of a soothing behavior happening, which happens in addiction as well. Addiction is coping with pain, but there's not so much this reward when you're watching negative news or like feeling the drip of conspiracy about this bad thing that's taking over the world. That's a little different because it's
Yeah.
not rewarding you. It's
It's
actually quite
horror.
it's actually quite negative. Yeah. So this is
Yeah.
very similar to OCD in that people will do things very compulsively that could be quite destructive in their lives. That doesn't necessarily give them pleasure per se, but it
Yeah.
soothes some underlying obsessive need for a sense of certainty.
Right.
And so this negative news, it's almost like it's fueling a sense of uncertainty. So you try to gain the certainty by continually going back to compulsively checking the news. Like, okay, what's happening? I'm going to check, and you are kind of drawn to this kind of a compulsive way to work with the obsessive thoughts of, well, what if this bad thing happens? And so we have our preferred news sources, and this is confirmation bias. We are drawn to sources that confirm our pre-existing beliefs, and so we tune into our news source, and we get comfort and certainty in, like, we know what to almost expect.
Right.
So there's that compulsive comforting, self-soothing, gaining a sense of certainty even if it's negative certainty. And and the negativity bias in our brains says this is something I really need to continually tune into and keep checking because it's super important. Negative stuff is is more salient in our minds than positive stuff, because negative things can actually ruin our lives very, very fast.
Right.
Positive things can maybe incrementally make them better slowly over time.
Right.
There is actually something called negativity bias in psychology, where bad emotions and bad negative feedback hold more weight to us psychologically than positive news and positive feedback. And you can only imagine that when you get a negative comment on your stuff or assignment that you've done, you focus just on that negative thing. You can
Right.
have all the positive feedback in the world. You get that one negative comment, and you're like, and you're thinking about it, you're dwelling on it. And why is that? Well, again, because negative things are way more dangerous. Evolutionarily speaking, you can be eaten by a lion very fast versus finding food sources and getting slightly better, in nutrition over time. And you can see this when you're driving, for example. If you pay attention to the reckless bad driver way more than you pay attention to the good driver. You're not driving along and saying, oh, look how great that person is driving right there. They just signaled perfect textbook driving,
Right.
because they're, it's not going to affect you as much. You're not going to say, oh, thank you for keeping me safe on the road. You're going to look at that negative driver, maybe have road rage and focus on them and fixate on them and think about them the rest of your day. And our brains are wired to really focus on that negative stuff, because it can really take you out faster than the positive stuff can make you better.
Do you think it's a perception? Is it a flaw in perception then? Because just from the way you describe it, if somebody is on the road driving, but the negatively driving person is on a lane so far away, and yet there's supposed to be police that's checking them, and the patrol car is just behind him, then our obsession with that would indicate something more than just insecurity. It almost feels like we don't see the patrol car going to check that person. We feel as if this car is coming towards us or is near us. And that's why we're paying attention to so much negative news. But maybe there are people who feel certain that we have systems in place to protect us, politically, security. And so we don't worry as much. But then there are people who don't have any of that sense of security. Like I'll give you an example. I have friends who come from countries that, have failed governments, and I've noticed in talking to them that they tend to be that person who can feel that car is coming towards them.
That's the perfect. Yeah, that's the perfect way to bring it from the psychological to the social. I love that. And it relates to trust in government, trust in larger systems. And now you get into the political divide where people more so on the left tend to, or northern parts of the United States, coastal regions of the US, they're more trusting of the systems and government, and there's a historical reason behind this as well, versus people on the right, which they tended to live in more rural areas where you had to kind of protect yourself because you didn't have the local government or police right there to kind of take care of things. So there's more of a culture of honor that actually developed in these more rural areas, more of an independence attitude, more libertarian ideas. And so I'm saying all this in a very neutral way, not necessarily saying one's good or bad or anything. It's just different. And so if you find yourself in these more right-leaning areas or libertarian areas or areas of distrust of the government generally, there could be those conspiracy theories. There could be more fear and a need to really do what we're talking about here, like driving on the road. You got to protect yourself because you can't trust that someone else is going to do it for you. And it kind of, that's how it brings it into these psychological processes.
Right. Because I think for me, I just look at all the news that's negative as almost being the driver who needs to watch. Oh, sorry. I'm gonna have to repeat that.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I look at the news as, you know what, I need to pay attention, one, for my job, and two, because I need to know what's going on, but just enough that I can still live a healthy life. I'm constantly trying to get to understand what that compulsion is. What is that compulsion? Is it coming from a fear of, um, uncertainty about the future, or is there something bigger going on? Is it a
Yeah,
personality thing?
well, it would be very much compulsions are based in fear. Like if you look
Yeah,
at obsessive compulsive disorder, the obsessive thoughts are generally fear based. It's thoughts like, what if I can't put food on the table, for example,
yeah,
if I lose my job, lose my business.
yeah,
There's the obsessive ruminating thoughts that are replaying and replaying. And ultimately, although they're supposed to be useful, evolutionarily speaking, your thoughts are and your worries are supposed to keep you safe.
yeah.
It can actually kind of go the other way. And that's what counseling I do a lot of is this help? Is this actual obsessive thinking helping you, or is it actually making it worse? And that's another question. But to the more sociological question, um, it would be very much from that place of uncertainty, and people who are business owners are, I guess, tend to be most vulnerable, therefore having the most fear, and a lot of this the compulsiveness of what may be going on is very much driven by this fear, which is warranted, of course.
Of course.
And so, but there's the psychological component as well, of how can when I work with clients one-on-one, how do you optimize your chances that it's going to go well despite it being a bad situation? So there's really both those layers there. There's the social problem, and then there's the psychological problem, and they're
Right,
connected, but they're also separate in a way too.
right. Um, I think for a lot of business owners, obviously they have a certain type of personality, right, where they almost risked everything they had to start something, and then because they want to take control over their finances or over their careers, and to have a government come in and then disrupt that, I think that will be a harder blow. And if somebody, for example, hasn't gotten, what happens to the people who, maybe were using substances recreationally, but now feel a sense of a loss of control? Can that then spiral into real addictions?
Yeah. Oh, very much. And I love how you kind of brought this full circle to the first topic we discussed in terms of personality and addiction. And you can say, yeah, perhaps what we were talking about in the beginning, the more risk taking uh, type of personality, people who are willing to just risk it all, like almost like gambling in a way, but starting a business is not purely gambling. It's not completely random. There's a lot under your control.
Mhm.
Not everything, but you can control quite a bit. And so this type of person could be drawn to starting a business, and then the government obviously disrupting that, and now contributing to more distrust of the government.
Yeah.
And with that kind of spirit of entrepreneurship and independence and
Mhm.
risk-taking personality, it's like, okay, I'm going to take it matters into my own hands. I can't trust the government because it did something that disrupted my business. And so this is not taking a stance either way. This is not like saying, the government did something bad, and it's not taking a stance on COVID. It's kind of getting into more of the psychology of how this might feel for a lot of people. Not all business owners, of course.
Yeah.
And I've talked to many that are very much rule abiding, and they trust. Just yesterday, I literally talked to someone who's like, I locked my doors and I've been going above and beyond what the government recommends for safety protocols. So there's a whole kind of range of responses in terms of entrepreneurs. But just kind of speaking more broadly and generally, that's kind of where we're at here. Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty much the same here. I talk to a lot of business owners, small business owners, and just some of them telling you that, there are people in their industry who haven't been able to hack it. There's so many that have failed. And I'm just thinking what that means in terms of addictions, whether we have the coping mechanisms to handle huge levels. I'm trying to think what impact will this have on our societies? Do you have any advice for someone who isn't an addict, who doesn't need to get help, but is goes on your website and reads and can see some of the traits and some of the symptoms that suggest an addiction might be oncoming? Can that person self-help?
Yeah, and it really depends kind of where you are in terms of severity. If it's just kind of starting, you're probably more likely to be able to do the self-help strategies.
Yeah.
And this kind of plays into one of my roles, actually. I am part-time employed doing with a service for COVID-19 counseling. So people who can call a number if they're experiencing difficulties related to the pandemic. And so I do a lot of counseling around mental health, just, pandemic effects every day. And so there's no general, I guess, one advice piece I can give. It really depends on the person. And what I would do is meet someone where they're at and look at what are they going through, what are they experiencing, and kind of work collaboratively with them wherever they are. And so maybe one general advice is not necessarily
Maybe
applicable.
the thing to help people is to first of all understand what drives addiction.
What drives addiction? And again, that is a range of many possible things, all the way from past traumas, adverse childhood experiences. The research shows is huge, huge, huge.
Ooh.
Yeah. When I speak with people, my own clients, one of the most common themes I hear is that there was kind of a chaotic upbringing,
Right.
emotional coldness, invalidation, meaning criticism, and so, or kind of neglect, kind of those themes, or kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, extreme rigidity, strictness, but there's also that kind of emotional closeness as well. And so there's an actual concept of emotional abuse. And so it's not physical abuse, but it's not tending to the emotional needs of the child. And so they are, this is an actual thing, and it's huge, huge. And this is one of the most common things. So when I say adverse childhood experiences, it doesn't mean you were like abandoned and beaten or whatever. And it could be some of these things, but it could also be more subtle things where you can say, that's not me. I don't have adverse childhood experiences. But sometimes when I actually get into it with people and we kind of dig down and we look at what was going on, like, oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, that it wasn't obvious. It looked like it was very nice on the surface. But there was actually, my emotional needs were not being met at all. And so that's one of the big things to delve into if you're starting to find you're slipping into something. It could be, is there something there? And through conversation with a counselor or someone who's neutral, it could be a way to discover that.
Yeah.
Right? It's hard to do when you're in your own head, when you're not getting feedback, because oftentimes people say, well, that was just my normal. And they often didn't realize it wasn't until they met a partner who had a healthy upbringing, or talk to a counselor who kind of gave that neutral feedback of, actually, this was not normal or not okay and not meeting your needs. And people can go with that their whole lives and it not really be necessarily an issue. But when we're talking about now they're losing a business or a job or a sense of purpose or feeling isolated or anxious, now it could kind of trigger and bring up a lot of stuff that wasn't necessarily didn't necessarily have to be dealt with. So there could be stuff there, or it may not be so much about one's early childhood experiences, and it could be really more about current situations and looking at what's going on right now. Are you engaging in self-care? Are you neglecting kind of your own needs? Where's your sleep? Where's your food intake? Where's your exercise? And so there's a whole range of factors, and it's really dependent on what that person is missing or what they're going through.
Right. Because as you're saying all of this, I'm thinking of the fact that the whole world probably had a lot of time for a year to exercise in self-care. But it's interesting how I think in the beginning, a lot of people took time to do that. But as it's gone on, then uncertainty and fear has kicked in.
Yeah.
And so do you think that's when the levels of uncertainty increase, then it's really difficult to maintain healthy habits, because the fear of or the uncertainty of the future then bleeds into. Yeah.
Exactly that. Self-care is easy when things are good, and you're like, oh, okay, well, I kind of needed some time off. I was working too hard in January and February and March, of last year. It's kind of like, oh, sure, I'll take a couple weeks off until this thing blows over. And people were kind of almost excited. Some people were excited more than others, I guess. But it was more of that self-care. I'm going to do some hobbies, take some time, generally speaking, which is easy to do when there's not a lot of fear driving it. Now, as we said with the example of the good driver, that's equivalent to praising self-care. You're focusing on things that'll bring you from baseline to positive.
Right.
And we can do that when we're in a state of no fear. But when there's fear there, now that other dangerous driver comes in.
Yeah.
It's not about what gets us from baseline to positive now, to self-care. It's about, how do I get out of this negative space? And so that's where we get into the self-soothing, such as addictions or compulsive behaviors, compulsive checking, and attempts to seek certainty, and often unhelpful attempts to seek certainty, like overthinking is another example of trying to seek certainty. If I just think about it enough, if I worry about it enough, maybe I'll come up with an answer in my head, and I'll figure it out, and I'll have certainty. And so some of the ruminating and the obsessive kind of thoughts that could be a compulsive way of thinking, in a sense, that you're repeatedly thinking about something as an attempt to soothe yourself, to gain certainty where you cannot get certainty. And so for sure, self-care and all these positive habits are very difficult when you're operating from a place of running away from pain.
Right. And do you think that it is possible to recover from addiction? Let's say everything goes back to normal, the vaccine works, and, I mean, everyone says there's not going to be a normal that we know to be normal. But let's say that we go back to have some stability in our lives. What then for people? Do you think the people who've kind of been relying on substances will be able to, recover?
Well, I'm very hopeful, for sure. I'm very hopeful, and vast majority of people can recover in time. Now, the vast majority don't recover the first attempt. So there's a huge chunk of people that it takes several attempts, but most people do recover over time.
Yeah.
And I've seen countless examples of people actually going through very dramatic recoveries and coming from places, extreme lows, extreme trauma and adverse experiences, all the way back to childhood. Long-term substance use, really back to childhood in a sense as well. And so people do recover, and we are resilient, and it is possible. And I see it all the time. And the research even shows that it happens. This is not just kind of a false optimism. And so, yeah, I do suspect there's going to be difficulties in
Yeah.
the short to medium term, but in the long term,
Mhm.
with the right resources, people can and do recover.
What patterns have you noticed in people who do recover and go on to live fairly healthy lives?
Hmm. Well, let's see. Some general things, kind of a focus on what you can control and an ability to let go of things you cannot control,
Yeah.
which is really the heart of the Serenity Prayer, if you're familiar with
Yeah,
that.
no, I saw on your website that you have a prayer, the Serenity Prayer.
And that's kind of a Christian thing. It's not. I'm not necessarily.
I've heard of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it to let go of things? I think I've heard it in a song actually.
Mhm.
Is it letting go of things that you can't control?
And the
Something
courage
like
to encourage to do the things that you can.
that.
Um, and so this is kind of this old, goes back to the Christian theologian, and it's really made popular by the 12-step movement in the United States, which is 12-step recovery, like Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. So this prayer is something that they actually regularly will say in those types of meetings.
Mhm.
Uh, but there's actually great psychological wisdom in that idea as well. It's not just relevant for addiction, but for really mental health and recovery in general. It's that letting go of the things we don't have control over, like a lot of stuff, like how people behave, what the government does. I mean, we have a small percentage of control. We can vote, we can advocate, but you really don't have direct control over so many things. And so there's a letting go process, and then doing the things that you can
Yeah.
directly control. And that is a huge part of recovery, because what it does is it gives you kind of practical small next steps. What can I do?
Yeah.
And it's a constant letting go of the things that are plaguing you, like maybe thoughts that are they're repetitive, or histories, or resentments. There's a nice quote I also heard: life is like monkey bars. In order to move forward, you have to learn to let go.
How can we help people who really struggle with letting go of the things they cannot control?
And that's a process. So there's no like, oh, do this.
Mhm.
It's there
They need counseling.
potential. There's a potential that could be helpful. Counseling could be beneficial for most people, but I guess not they don't necessarily need counseling, but it could be helpful. There's an article I've written on how to stop living in your head that kind of relates to this, and I'm actually building a digital course right now on how to do this. I'm kind of in the
Okay.
middle of actually putting this together, and there are exercises that maybe we can.
Like meditation, because I
Yes.
do I do meditation, different forms
Yeah.
to do that.
Uh, and so meditation, mindfulness exercises could be one way to do this. There's a good meditation called Leaves on a Stream meditation. You can actually search YouTube for Leaves on a Stream meditation or exercise, and it
Okay.
kind of guides you through this visual metaphor of
Right.
imagining your thoughts like leaves on a stream. And so you can focus on the here and now, the sensations in your body, the breath, whatever's helpful for you. Some people don't like focusing on the breath, but just focusing on your senses generally,
Right.
what's happening right now. And when a thought comes in, you imagine there's like a leaf in a stream in front of you floating by. You kind of put it on there. You're just going to watch it. It can
Right.
swirl around a little bit. It can go here and there. Maybe it'll get stuck on a rock, but you can let it go, let it flow down the stream. It's kind of watching your thoughts rather than being fused to your thoughts. So this kind of imagery, this kind of exercise, there's many more techniques around this we don't necessarily have time to get into. But if somebody wanted to learn more, I do have an article on my website called "How to Stop Living in Your Head."
Okay.
Or and then there's a how to increase psychological flexibility,
Okay.
and how to be more flexible in life. So there's kind of 3 articles that I kind of did around this idea. And so I'm in the midst of doing that right now. And maybe we can reconnect in the future.
Yes, I would love that.
Perfect. All right.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Take care.
Bye, Dr. Steve. Bye.
Bye.